From The Australian, here's what's on the front. I'm Kristen Amiot. It's Wednesday, July 16, 2025. The second legal team representing accused murderer Beau Lamar Condon has quit. Lawyer Alexander Terracini told the court on Monday issues had arisen that prevented him from continuing the matter. The former New South Wales police officer is charged with the murder of Channel 10 presenter Jesse Baird and his partner, Qantas flight attendant Luke Davies. He hasn't entered a plea but is expected to defend the charges. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull discussed the shortcomings of AUKUS with Pentagon Policy Chief Elbridge Colby before he was charged with conducting a crucial review of the military pact. That exclusive story from our Washington correspondent Joe Kelly is live right now at theaustralian.com.au. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese scored a rare invite to dine with Chinese President Xi Jinping after the pair met for a fourth time on Monday. Today, our North Asia correspondent Will Glasgow unpacks the meeting where what wasn't discussed was just as interesting as what was. Right at the tippy top of Australia, where the Timor Sea flows into the Beagle Gulf, you'll find the Port of Darwin. To call it strategically significant would probably be an understatement. It's a major gateway for trade with our neighbours in the Indo-Pacific and regularly hosts all manner of vessels, from cruise liners to Navy warships. In 2015, the Chinese-owned Landbridge Group was granted a 99-year lease for the port, worth just over $500 million. But a lot's changed since then, and as China muscles in on the Indo-Pacific, the Albanese government is planning to take back control.
A port caught in a political storm, ownership of the Port of Darwin to be stripped from a Chinese company, ending a decade of debate.
We have a clear view, which is that it should be in Australian hands.
How Prime Minister Anthony Albanese would broach this touchy subject in his meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping was anyone's guess. But then, it just didn't come up.
It looks like, or sounds like, President Xi didn't want to ruin the mood, you know?
Will Glasgow is the Australian's North Asia correspondent. I spoke to him between meetings in Beijing's opulent Great Hall.
The Chinese state has gone out of its way to try to pump up this trip as being a success almost before it's happened. There's been laudatory coverage of the Australian Prime Minister and state media, and today there was a tone-setting editorial in the China Daily, and that one was very laudatory of the Prime Minister. Now, nothing would ruin the mood more like threatening economic consequences if Australia goes ahead with, or if the Prime Minister goes ahead with that election commitment to end the ownership, the Chinese company that owns the Port of Darwin. Now, that doesn't mean the issue's resolved. I would mark that as something that's been pushed into the future. They've made a decision not to let it get in the way of this trip. I think it's sort of over to the Australian government to somehow try to negotiate that process in a way that doesn't embarrass the Chinese. It's also possible that Premier Li, who the Prime Minister's meeting with as I speak to you in the Great Hall, that conversation is happening right now. It's possible that Xi Jinping's delegated the Port of Darwin conversation to Premier Li. The Prime Minister also said that President Xi didn't bring up the investment regime at all in Australia. Now, that suggests to me that conversation's also been handballed to Premier Li. I'd be amazed if that's not raised during this meeting that they're having right now.
In March, a flotilla of Chinese warships entered Australian waters, where they conducted live fire exercises and embarked on a circumnavigation of the country.
Caused chaos in the air between New Zealand and Australia, forcing the diversion of 49 flights when it began a live fire exercise.
The Australian Defence Force hastily deployed 2 vessels to surveil the Chinese task group, and on Tuesday, the Prime Minister said President Xi has committed to being more transparent about Beijing's plans in future.
I said what I said at the time, which was that it was within international law. There was no breach of international law by China, but that We were concerned about the notice and the way that it happened, including the live fire exercises.
What's just happened on this trip is President Xi has told the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese this directly. He said, China's going to operate off Australia and in other international waters just as Australia does off China's coast. In other words, get used to it. There's going to be no end to those People's Liberation Navy exercises. They're going to continue to show their ability to operate further and further from China. And that clearly includes, as we learnt with that circumnavigation of Australia earlier this year, that includes the entirety of the Australian coastline. So yeah, the takeout is get used to it.
Will says that same takeout applies to talk of a potential conflict over Taiwan.
This is one where Xi Jinping's made very clear China's policy, and that is, as he sees it, Taiwan's coming back to Beijing rule. That's not negotiable. The Australian government, Prime Minister Albanese, in his meeting with President Xi, said Australia supports the status quo and opposes any non-peaceful, euphemism for violent, warlike, taking of Taiwan.
Well, what we did was we put forward Australia's position, or I did, which is that we want peace and security in the region. That is in the interests of both Australia and in the interests of China.
That concern that it's not unique to Australia, but is shared in capitals all around the world, that remains. And right now, as these meetings are taking place in Taipei, there are their annual military drills, which are becoming more serious every year as they try to get the Taiwanese population to appreciate that risk has risen so much, and they're trying to prepare them for what life might be like in that horrible scenario if it happens.
Coming up, why Chinese media is heaping praise on the PM. On Tuesday, ahead of the Prime Minister's meeting with President Xi Jinping, the state-owned English-language newspaper China Daily released a glowing editorial about Anthony Albanese's week-long visit. We've used AI to bring parts of that publication to life.
Against the backdrop of rising tensions between the United States and many countries because of the US administration's recent threat to levy higher tariffs on them from August 1st, Albanese's visit shows that the Australian side has a clearer judgment and understanding of China than it had under the previous Scott Morrison government.
That, of course, is a reference to the dire state of the bilateral relationship before Albanese's time. Beijing was so offended by Scott Morrison's suggestion China was responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic, the Chinese government slapped Australia with tariffs and bans on a whole host of agricultural products, like wine, barley and rock lobster. But after Labor won government in 2022, the relationship thawed and exports resumed.
That Albanese and the sizable business delegation accompanying him are meeting with representatives from the tourism and sports sectors in Shanghai and Chengdu points to the importance Australia attaches to expanding its economic cooperation with China.
Will Glasgow says this type of editorial is intended to be read by visiting diplomats, and it gives a pretty good indication of China's mood towards Australia right now.
Look, words matter in the Chinese system, and that was a really important tone-setting editorial. It's showing that China wants Australia to know, but the world to know that it considers its relationship with Australia to be going well and that it's improved a lot. I mean, it makes explicit in that editorial that it blames the last Australian government, Scott Morrison's government, for what went wrong. They were quite explicit in their criticism of him all the way until the 2022 election. And when Albanese came in 2022, they weren't subtle in claiming it as something of a victory for China. And they've kind of cheered him all the way along during the last 3 years. They have been frustrated by, at times, the way he's adopted a lot of the Morrison government's policy and also how he's created a formula where he continues to speak about difficult parts of the relationship and areas where Australia and China profoundly disagree, particularly in the security space. But my view on that is, and that editorial makes this exact point, this is so much to do with how China sees America and an opportunity it has right now to really press its interests and maybe transform some of its relations with formal US treaty allies, as there's a president in the White House who is just roiling the international system and putting unprecedented stress on the US alliance network. This is a time of great historic change. Xi Jinping sees a lot of opportunity in that. And, they see Anthony Albanese playing a role in there as well. Frankly, Trump is so self-absorbed, I'd be stunned if he even knew it was taking place. There's certainly people in his administration, though, people in the Pentagon, people in the State Department and other parts of that system who'll be watching this very closely, and they won't like it at all.
Will Glasgow is the Australian's North Asia correspondent. You can read the latest from the Prime Minister's trip to China right now at theaustralian.com.au.